the technology crunch. Just trying to share my screen, and I'm not sure what's going on. Something's having to minimize. But anyway, I'm Richard Ballantyne from the British Ports Association, and thank you, Sue, so much for the offer and invitation to join this session. Tim, my colleague from the UK Major Ports Group, is going to follow me and give an overview from his perspective. But you've got effectively the two ports associations here. And let me just see if I can show. I've got a few slides which hopefully will be of interest, and which I'm very happy for Sue and colleagues to share after the event. Let's just see if this works as we struggle with the technology. I hope you can see that. Let me just start the. What am I doing? Sorry. How do I? This is. Oh, here we are. Apologies. There we go. So as I say, Richard Ballantyne from the British Ports Association. So we're a trade association for ports and harbours, and just there's a bit of the guff about ourselves as I describe it. A range of different types of ports, lots of sort of varying operations around the UK, not just port authorities, also terminals and a range of other operations, etc. And not just cargo handling ports. There's a lot of other type of activities, energy hubs, passenger facilities, small harbours that handle yachts and fishing vessels, etc. So a full range of different types of operations here, and we represent all the major energy gateways and terminals, passenger ports, and predominantly most of the ro-ro ports, certainly the big ones, who are the subject of probably most of the issues we're going to consider today. And just a quick summary, because I know this is a international audience. UK ports are independent and effectively financially and strategically independent of the government in the UK, and they run commercially in competition with one another unless they're owned by the same group, etc. So there is always that dynamic to throw into things. And then finally, recently the UK government has compiled some port traffic forecasts, which it predicts UK port traffic to grow by around 40%, notwithstanding Brexit or coronavirus impacts by 2050. And a lot of that actually is unitized freight, so goods that are transported predominantly through containers, but also ro-ro. Now, what does Brexit actually mean for everyone? So effectively, Brexit is it's about the UK leaving the customs union and the single market, and they are the institutions that are designed to facilitate, in our case, the seamless transport of goods and people across borders, etc. So it's, as you will appreciate, quite a dramatic move to depart the customs union and the single market, because now we will have things like product controls and checks at our frontiers. And the biggest, as I mentioned, the biggest challenge potentially is for roll-on, roll-off traffic, which is either driver accompanied, so goods that are transported by a lorry driver who takes them through somewhere like Eurotunnel or Dover or one of the short straight crossings, or unaccompanied, which is where a trailer is taken to a port terminal, as you probably know, and dropped off by a different driver who collects it at the other end. Just getting a bit of noise here. I don't know if everyone can mute their microphones if they've joined recently. Thank you. Separately, the government, in preparation for this, has been looking at the impacts of goods being subject to these controls at all ports of entry in the UK. And so all the sort of non-ro-ro traffic, there are still substantial things that a lot of operators have to do, new customs software interfacing with the HM Revenue and Customs in the UK, and also the controls that those goods are subject to, whether they're being kept in storage at a facility in the port. There's quite a few things that are going to change. So the government has set up a broader protocol and delivery group in the UK, which is currently housed in the UK Cabinet Office, one of the departments, looking at sort of resilience and cross activities, etc. And it's designed a border operating model which details the new requirements and processes that trade and traffic will be subject to. And as part of the discussion with the UK and sorry, the EU around the changes, the UK government decided that it will not enforce import controls from our date of exit from the EU, which is the 1st of January this year when we had the end of the transitional arrangements, but has instead delayed these controls on inbound traffic until January 2022. And that is largely because to give the traffic extra time to prepare, and there was an additional extension to the delayed introduction sort of earlier this year because some of the infrastructure was likely not to be ready at the port gateways, but we'll no doubt come to that later in the discussions. So what are ports actually doing? That's probably what you're probably most interested in knowing. The ports have a choice of the types of customs process and models that they will implement to handle the goods coming in from the EU. And the first is the temporary storage model, which is described by the government as the system that many ports have been operating third country goods and controls up until now already, effectively allowing ports to handle those goods and store them for up to 90 days at their facility. And then alongside that, in recognition, I guess, of the sensitive nature of just-in-time logistics that Sue mentioned at the beginning, and the unique, I guess, relationship the UK has with the EU, with the amount of ro-ro traffic we have, which is much higher in proportion than most other maritime nations, and the sensitivity of holding those roads goods vehicles up and their trailers up. They've designed a goods vehicle movement service. So effectively, this is a pre-lodgement system which will enable traders to pre-lodge their customs declaration in advance of arrival into the UK, and then it's approved pretty quickly, pretty rapidly when they get through, and pending any sort of further inspections that may be required, those goods are able to be transported on as seamlessly as possible, although there will be, of course, some friction which we didn't have previously. And it's probably fair to say this was designed particularly in mind of the driver accompanied routes into the UK, those ro-ro routes, which predominantly transports the sort of highest proportion of value goods from the EU, and a lot of things like foods and other just-in-time logistics and other commodities for niche sectors and important sectors, including the automotive sectors. And now, of course, because the UK government can't provide this system just to driver-accompanied ro-ro ports, they've expressed their intention to allow any port to utilise this, although in actual fact, only a handful of ports, we understand, are going to make use of this. Most will be using the traditional temporary storage model, where customs are approved when they enter the UK in the traditional manner. Just very briefly, I'm not going to dwell too long on this, but the other thing that we're grappling with in the port sector is and particularly for BPA, is on the Irish Sea. We have the Northern Irish Protocol, which no doubt you've all heard and read about, etc. But effectively, this was agreed between the EU and the UK as a way of enabling the Irish land border to remain frictionless, and the consequence of that has been to plot a partial customs border down the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and also have some further implications for goods whilst they're subject to food and sanitary controls when they arrive in Ireland, and some arrangements that work the other way, but perhaps not quite as onerous. Now that is all in place, of course, so that has started on the 1st of January. There's no extension to that, and the ports and others have been getting to grips with that, and we've seen one or two issues. And alongside that, a trader support service, the TSS, was established by government effectively as a window for customs entries to be submitted through. And that is, I don't propose to go into any great detail on that, but there's one or two technical issues with that which people are getting used to as well. And not least the fact that there's the sort of political element being discussed alongside that. So Sue, that's my sort of overview of things from my point of view. Tim's going to come back, I think, with some more perhaps kind of looking forward, but thanks very much. And so back to you.
Lovely, thanks Richard, and that's a great overview and gives us a great thing. If anybody's got any questions for Richard or wants further bits expanded upon, if you put it into the chat after all the speakers have gone through their presentations, then I'll put them to the panel. So feel free to put anything into the chat. Don't use the Q&A, please use the chat. It's just much easier for us all to see them. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Peter and Sally Ann from Reed Smith, who are going to give you a legal and a case study point of view of what's happening actually in reality. So over to Peter and Sally Ann.
Okay, well, thanks, Sue. I'm going to start and Sally Ann's going to come on. My name is Peter Ferrigno and I am a senior tax counsel at Reed Smith. Hopefully, I'm part of the, hopefully you can see my slides if they're sharing. I'm just trying to work out how to get them to move. Here you go. That worked fine in the rehearsals. There we go. Yep, so I'm part of the Brexit team, responsibility for customs in association with our European customs team in Brussels. And Sally Ann is partner in the shipping group, but she will introduce herself later. As to build on what Richard said, Brexit has happened and the UK has become a third country for the EU from a trade and customs perspective. So it's important to remember that these aren't new rules completely designed from scratch. The UK has just gone from the category of being an EU member to not being an EU member, and many of the rules and regulations that we're coming up against are the ones that US companies or Chinese companies have always had to comply with. The only difference, of course, is they tend to ship in large volumes, one container with one single product in, whereas going short across the channel, you tend to have many, many more different products on a single lorry than you would have if it was going a longer distance. So the free flow of goods across borders has been allowed, but it's dependent on having the paperwork in place. And I think this was the surprise of people is what the paperwork is, how much is required and what the level of detail you need to go into. As I think particularly the first 5 months, we've seen significant shifts in the flows of trade, particularly where goods have come into the EU through the UK and then onwards to the rest of the EU, or like alternatively into the mainland EU and then across to the UK, because that has suddenly become much more complicated than it was before. I'll come back to that. Richard's already said that some of these changes were delayed already till 2022. I want to give you a little summary of what the timelines were for the relevant levels of checks and balances to come in, so you know what's changed, what's still to come, because complicated though it may be at the moment, we haven't yet reached full end game on importation to the UK from the EU. It's the EU has been ready from day one. Stuff going from the UK to the EU, that's got the full documentation requirement, but stuff coming in is the other way around, and that hasn't yet. So things are going to get worse before they get better potentially if we're not careful. So the free movement of goods. There was a lot talked about, okay, well, it's great, we have tariff-free and quota-free movement, so that's good. That's only true if the rules of origin are met. So you can send UK stuff to the EU free of tariff and free of quota, or EU stuff to the UK, but that doesn't necessarily mean that stuff can hop and skip through one to the other. So things like Chinese goods or American goods passing through the UK on the way to the EU don't qualify for preference when you try and clear them in the EU from the UK. So you potentially have two levels of customs declaration, which you wouldn't have had before. Secondly, customs declarations are required. Anyone that's tried to send a birthday present to a distant cousin on the EU mainland and found that they've had to go to the post office and pay customs and VAT, or anyone who's ordered anything on Amazon from outside the UK has suddenly realized that this is much more difficult than it was before. There's also aspects like product registration and certificates of conformity. Any product that was comply with EU product regulations, now also needs to comply with UK regulations to be sold in the UK. And then there's the whole sanitary and phytosanitary regulations, the famous sausage wars that are about to kick off, if you believe the newspapers, as the threat of the single market that comes from unfrozen sausages crossing a border. Very, very real live example. Also, there were customs duties and VAT exemptions for low value items that came through the post. This was when you bought stuff on Amazon from China. That was going to change in the EU anyway from July the 1st. The UK leaving the EU just brought those changes forward to January the 1st. So cheap rubbish that you bought from China has become more expensive already. The EU doesn't get that benefit until 2 weeks' time. Sorry, I should probably not say cheap rubbish, but any stuff below that level. So this was the little table on the right was some stuff that came from the EU at the time, so demonstrating the difference between what's in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and what the UK had as being as being a member state. I mean, free movements of people, free movement of goods. I mean, there are specific conditions in the agreement there, which is the amber rather than the red. And this was obviously written by the EU to say, look what you've lost. But even so, you can see that certain things, there is very big differences between being a member state and having a trade and cooperation agreement, which we have seen in practice. What we typically see, these are the issues that our clients are coming to us about at the moment or have done over the first five months. Clearly the rules of origin application and tariffs still being payable if goods don't meet those requirements. And there's said already the need for duty to potentially be paid twice over. Certain foods require health certificates, and this has become quite a significant area now, particularly you see small producers of cheese or whatever that wanted to export to the EU. Veterinary certification to prove that it met the requirements has now become a need, and certainly for many small shipments, this has become very uneconomic. Also, if you're looking at groupage shipments where you have multiple different suppliers shipping on one truck, one supplier's paperwork being slightly incomplete means the whole truck can potentially get held up. So this has made a significant difference to small volume shipments going across into Europe from the UK. Northern Ireland is special rules apply with the border in the Irish Sea to avoid having one on land, and the paperwork is much more complex for shipments to the Northern Ireland rather than to the rest of Great Britain. We've got a case study example coming up for one of our clients that actually imports into Northern Ireland via the UK, and we'll just give you a flavour of the types of compromises that have or the complexities that come up. There has been a massive increase in the number of direct shipments going between the Republic of Ireland and the west coast of France. You can see, I think, obviously, as shipping people and ferries and ports people, you will probably see more than we do the increase in the number of sailings, an increase in the number of boats being redeployed to there, and that I think has been quite a significant change there, which has also taken a lot of traffic off the roads in the UK, which has been an advantage potentially. The UK has talked a lot about ports and free ports, and in the budget in March they introduced some free port systems. I will come on to that. Much has been said about now we're not as part of the EU, we can have free ports. Of course, free ports were always permitted as being part of the EU, and the previous ones lapsed because they weren't being used much. However, this could be an answer to some of the double duty aspects there. So I want to cover just in one slide free ports. I think Sue said that you'll have a separate session on free ports later in the year. So I don't want to steal the thunder whoever's going to present that, but I will just touch on it. So rules of origin. Products must originate in the UK for the preferential tariff arrangement in the EU or vice versa. This evidence can be, doesn't have to be massively onerous. The agreement has got relatively simple rules around how you evidence it. The supplier can just give a declaration, and there's a standard prescribed format in the TCA saying this is what it needs to look like, or the importer can say, based on what I know, this is how it works. Certain products, particularly those that are made from a variety of inputs, have to have specific percentages to qualify, and this will vary by the CN code classic example of that is electric cars and batteries. There've been a phase in there, for example, over the next several years to ensure that there is a increase in battery manufacturing capacity in the EU. And there was a whole appendix to the agreement saying what the maximum permitted non-originating materials are by product category. Don't propose to go into that now. There are various rules of calculation for tolerances for non-qualifying minimum, things like excluding packaging materials from the calculation, all pretty standard if you've imported stuff from the US or China or anywhere else. Local content requirements vary extensively. There's a whole annex giving the requirements product by product, category by category. Unless the origin requirements are met, preferential tariff arrangements do not apply. So in practice, not all trade is tariff free. And I think this was a surprise to a lot of people early on, but I think people have got used to that a little more now than they thought at the time. Procedures are in line with international rules. Things like the Common Transit Convention apply. There's the mutual recognition of authorized economic operator status. So a lot of the paperwork, practicalities are trying to be as fair and reasonable as possible. There's the availability of advanced rulings if you need to classify how things, confirm how things are classified. And the temporary admission rules and things like ATA carnets for trade fairs, broadcast equipment, those procedures are there and they're in line and in accordance with what you would normally expect to see. Now, obviously, because there's been restrictions on people traveling and the amount of business travel or trade fairs going on at the moment, people haven't realized what those requirements are going to be yet. And so when people start traveling in Q2, Q3, Q4 this year and trade fairs start opening, people are going to get another round of surprise when they realize that they need customs declarations to take equipment with them. Declarations are required for every single shipment, and say things, SPS checks for things like food and plant materials and full border checks on shipments are going to be phased in under the border operating model that Richard mentioned, but those have been delayed or deferred, some of them until January 2022. Some of those changes have been agreed and some of them have been unilaterally imposed, and that has created its own interesting complexities as well. Now, Northern Ireland is, of course, the area where most of this becomes so obvious and becomes so clear because it is part of the UK, but also has free access to the Republic of Ireland, which is part of the EU. So to ensure that the island of Ireland doesn't have borders reimposed, there's a border being imposed in the sea instead, in the Irish Sea instead, to ensure that border leakage is controlled, because it could be relatively easy to use Northern Ireland as a route to smuggle things into the Republic of Ireland to get it into the EU. I think that's a theoretical possibility just because of the logistical challenge to get stuff routed all that way. But nevertheless, the integrity of the single market requires that borders are managed appropriately. The Northern Ireland Protocol is the name given to the document that covered all of that and that provided the additional checks. But that's the area that has become, still being discussed, and still the practicalities of that have created a whole industry of itself in dealing with that. So we wanted to give you a little example there about looking at tobacco products, because we have a client that is a tobacco manufacturer and it makes tobacco products within the EU and ships them into the UK or Great Britain. Sorry, I should make it clear. The UK is two separate customs territories now of Great Britain, which is England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which effectively your passport has always said the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But these distinctions are much more important than they used to be in the past. So you have an EU tobacco manufacturer shipping its products into the United Kingdom. They come into Great Britain, and to pass them on to customers in Northern Ireland, we've got to look at things like how they clear customs. Tobacco is obviously more complex because in addition to customs or import duty, it also has a higher level of excise duty. And Sally Ann, I'll hand you over to her. She will just take you through the issues and challenges we found with our tobacco industry client trying to get those products into Northern Ireland, which just highlights the unknown unknowns that we've dealt with. And while some of these may have been, a bit more practically orientated now, some of them are still some of these problems are still there. And so it gives you a good example of what we weren't expecting or were expecting, and then how we've had to deal with those things. So Sally Ann, over to you. I think you need to come off mute. If you...
Schoolgirl error there, sorry. Okay, try again. I'm so used to not being muted. Hi, I'm Sally Ann Underhill. I'm a partner at Reed Smith in the transportation group. So my clients are basically shipping clients and logistics clients. And so we receive the queries that they have in terms of the real practicalities of dealing with all of these issues. So in the context that we've just been discussing, that Peter has discussed, and thank you, Peter. I did say it when I couldn't be heard. Thank you, Peter, for handing over. The situation is that in terms of excise duty, and this is a client who, as Peter says, sells tobacco from the EU, and in the normal course of business is then selling tobacco into, and I'll split it up into Great Britain, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland. And when you do that, you have an option. Your first option is that you can, in terms of excise duty, you can pay it immediately when the goods are imported into the UK. And if you do that, the idea is that you don't pay again that same excise duty or any excise duty when the goods are then transported on to Northern Ireland. Or what you can do as the seller in that circumstance is you can suspend the payment of the excise duty when it comes into Great Britain. And then if you do that, you do need to pay, makes sense, when you then transport the goods over into Northern Ireland. The customs duty or import duty largely follows the excise duty, but the difficulty is that it's a whacking great rate. So I've got the figure here. The usual tobacco rate is 57.6%. So it's not a small amount of money. It's not something that you want to have to pay on numerous occasions. And the difficulty is that essentially, if you are in a position where you are paying, for example, when the goods come into the UK, what is meant then to happen, or we're coming into the GB, what is meant to happen, or perhaps at the worst possible scenario would be that there's no offset, but that you only pay more customs duty if the goods are going into Northern Ireland for distribution in the Republic. But what has actually been happening, and the concern is that the customs duty is being paid on multiple occasions. So it's being paid when the goods come into GB, and then it's being paid again when it's going over to Northern Ireland. And I'm not sure whether it's true or not, but the rumour is that then there can be further charges again when it goes into the Republic. I'm sure at least some of those can be recovered, but that's the concern that people have. So may I have the next slide, please, Peter? So our clients, as I say, had a situation where from their EU factories, what they ordinarily did was that they would bring their cargo over to Great Britain. And then if they wanted to transport the goods to the Northern Ireland customers, obviously the goods come into Great Britain and they're going everywhere. So they are coming in to the warehouse, and then they're going to be sent on to the Northern Ireland customers, amongst others. And so what they do is they disaggregate them and they reaggregate them and then send them off. And the problem arises when one of those reaggregations is going to Northern Ireland. So may I have the next slide, please? Okay, so this is nice and full, but I think it's worth explaining it. And I should just say that this is a situation which is a live example that we had that was a real problem at the time. You'll see in a minute the guidance that was given by HMRC, which was perhaps not completely satisfactory. And the difficulty I hope, and could even now be resolved, but it is an example of a live issue that people were having. So as I say, when the goods arrive in GB, there's an aggregate code that's created in the EU system, and that works in the track and trace system. So it works and it applies. But then once the goods are broken down and reduced from their large pallets into smaller pallets, the difficulty was that it was then not possible to re-scan those goods and to give them a new code, a new aggregation code, because by that stage they were being re-aggregated in GB, and so that didn't work in the EU system, in the track and trace system. There was no capacity for it to recognise a GB created aggregation code. And so the problem was that it was only accepted within the UK system. And the clients were therefore in a situation where, being an EU entity, they didn't want to be in a position where they were breaching any of the EU rules. And so they came to us and said, what do we do? And as I say at the bottom, there was always a realization that what might be needed was a complete change of system, and to stop coming via GB and stop this disaggregation and re-aggregation process, or to go directly to Northern Ireland. But those sorts of things take time, and you know, once you've got a product and you want to transport it, you're not really wanting to wait. So the difficulty was, how did they deal with it immediately? If I may have the next slide, please. So the HMRC's great recommendation was, let's not put on a re-aggregation code. Okay, it doesn't work, so let's not do it. And in lots of ways, that in itself makes beautiful sense. Okay, so it doesn't work, let's not do it. What they then said was, obviously, you've got various packaging, and the various packagings are all entered into the EU system, but it's this re-aggregation, this big sort of pallet code that was causing the problem. So let's not do that. Let's just work on those lower levels of codes, and we'll use those instead. Great plan. So that you'd have thought that what they were trying to do is say, this code that you're trying to use, this re-aggregation code created in GB, is not working. So let's use the other code, which is already in the EU system, and so that'll be fine. Obviously, it didn't work, because the system is set up that you can't change the level of aggregation of code. So if you put in a sort of fully aggregated code into the EU system when it leaves the EU, and then you send it somewhere, and then you think, oh, actually, I've got another code that did work in the EU system a while ago, let's just bung that in again, and that might enable us to go off to the Northern Ireland. That doesn't work either. So we were left with a situation where we had a code system that didn't work, but we were given an alternative code system that equally didn't work. But we had the reassurance, perhaps, that HMRC were recommending this course of action. And they said that as long as everything was tracked properly in the UK system, and I love this wording, as long as the stakeholders, as long as our client was doing its best, it was trying as much as possible to comply with the EU tobacco directive requirements, then that was okay. So you can imagine that the clients were still feeling that perhaps that wasn't the most fulfilling, satisfying and safest to this problem. Peter, I don't know whether you want to do the next slide, which is what you do when you've got these differing guidance from different people.
I have done the same, started talking on mute. Yes, do you think, yes, I think, as you say, the HMRC says, well, just try your best and you'll be all right. Then you think, well, is that really going to be enough? And, so who should you follow? Whose advice should you follow? So partly with export agreement. You talk to HMRC, and they said they're the entity that's actually going to police it, and they're the ones that's going to enforce it. So therefore, it's logical to say to them, should we do it the way you say it? And they say, well, yes, but if you're an EU entity that's the one that ends up re-importing stuff into Ireland, then when the HMRC and the UK is no longer part of the EU, would the European Commission accept HMRC's guidance if it was contrary to what they said? So you could ask the Commission instead, and then you get answers saying that what you're proposing is wrong, but because they don't know how the UK system will work anymore, particularly if there are any changes. And they can't claim that what you understand to be correct is based on the HMRC advice. So for our client's perspective, it was a very difficult situation what to do and how to do it. So I think in the end, it was just the best thing to do was import as much as possible before the 31st of December and hope. And then I think, since the increase in shipments via the west of France up through the Republic of Ireland, I think that's been the preferred solution to ensure that these problems don't come about. Because as you say, tobacco is just the most extreme example because the duty rates are so high. So you're always going to have a bigger problem here of getting it wrong. But if you've got if you've got to pay 5% on something else, it may or may not be the end of the world. But when you've got to pay 57, it definitely is the end of the world. So that's what we saw. And that's a good example of the problems you get in practice. I just want to touch on the changes to the dates and the increased checks. Originally, there were changes, additional clearances or documentation requirements for notification of animal products of animal origin, animal byproducts, high-risk food, and physical SPX checks. Were originally due to be phased in on the 1st of April or 1st of July. Some of those checks were to take place at the point of destination, and some of those were going to be shifted to border control points when those border control points were built. Not all those BCPs have yet been made or built and installed, so that's obviously created a reason for delaying. Also, there was the ability to defer declarations later rather than have the declaration filed at the time of importation. Again, that date has been deferred as well. So you can see the UK has taken the view that they're not quite ready for all of these paperwork checks yet, and so they've deferred these dates, and so things will continue to get, paperwork will continue to get more onerous over the coming 6 months, and changes will be required to how that information flows. I did say I'd touch on Freeports, and I say these were announced in the budget as part of the regional development strategy. A Freeport is an area where if stuff comes into the Freeport, it isn't actually deemed to be imported or customs cleared until it leaves the port into the UK territory. So it's a little ring-fenced city-state of its own from a customs perspective. So if something comes into the port there, you can then keep the goods there, and at a very simple level, you just get a deferral of the duty until the stuff moves into free circulation. Or if the items are going to be re-exported, you then avoid having the double duty problem that you have of bringing it in, clearing it, and shipping it out again. Now, most of these are seaports, but the East Midlands Airport, which is one of the larger port hubs for air freight distribution, is also part of that. So Freeport will have that opportunity to defer customs or excise or VAT clearance, but also package of tax benefits have been announced for the next 5 years to enable companies that invest in developing their capabilities in Freeport areas to get enhanced capital allowances for their land and buildings or their plant and machinery. There will be relief from stamp duty on the purchase of land and property used for the qualifying commercial purposes, and there'll be business rates exemptions as well. So if you are a company that is planning on expanding your warehousing or distribution capacity, a Freeport could be an interesting place to do this because of these benefits from a corporate tax, stamp tax perspective. There will also be ability to exempt national employers from national insurance contributions for part of it, but that will take separate legislation which is due to be passed. And the stated aim was that Freeports should be up and running by the end of 2021. here are the 8 free ports in England that were set up. Originally, it was intended and announced that Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland will potentially have the ability to announce their own, but none of those have been announced yet. And it's unclear whether any of them will announce them or not. So if you look, it does include some of the largest ports in the UK there. So if you are shipping and importing through those, then you should be able to avail yourself of the benefits of that. But again, it's the question is whether that creates new investment or whether it just shifts existing investment into those areas. And I think that was the concern about the previous round of free ports that ended up lapsing, was because it was whether it was just moving investment rather than creating new investment in its own right. But there will be a separate section on that. Just one last point, also the Partnership Council exists. So there are a whole variety of coordination bodies and specialised committees that have been set up under the governance of the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement goes through a Partnership Council. I think they had the first meeting of that last week. There are multiple committees to look at these things, and where you have issues around things like the rules of origin or the SPS measures or technical barriers to trade, there are trade specialised committees that are designed to look at this and take a practical view to clear these things up, and where their problems are identified, have a way of sorting those out. So there's a council, there's committees, and under the committees there are working groups as well. And that includes things like organic products, which I know Sue wanted me to mention as well, because there are, how you certify organic products is also covered by the TCA, and those things will change over the next year or two as well, and working groups around things like social security coordination as well. So there is a massive network of individual committees and working groups to make sure that as problems are identified, solutions should be identified, should be worked through to prevent the problems staying there forever. But this is very much a work in progress, and it will have, I think the agreement says, I think it will get, practically it's going to get looked at every 5 years or so. So it becomes a case of identifying problems, looking at what can be fixed by a agreement, and what requires a change to the TCA, and that would then come up over time. And I know a lot has been discussed already is, how frequently can you change trade agreements? And obviously they take a massive amount of time to discuss. So the practical problems are going to be with us for quite a few years. So that was all I had to say. Just a little bit. Reed Smith is an international law firm, particularly strong in shipping and transportation. We're predominantly a US firm, but with offices in many of the main markets of the EU, particularly in shipping hubs like Brussels, Frankfurt, Athens, and the Middle East, and also in the Far East. So we see a lot of these issues with our clients, and of course we're happy to answer any other questions that may come up from there. Thank you. So I'll hand you back to Sue.
Brilliant. Thank you, Peter and Sally Ann. That was really, really informative. And I think it's really good to have a hands-on experience of what's happening in the marketplace now. So thank you very much for that. And it gives me great pleasure now to invite Tim to talk to us.
Sue, can you see my screen? Can you see some slides? Perfect, right. So my name is Tim Morris. I run something called the UK Major Ports Group, which is a trade association for large port operators, as its name would suggest. That is, we have 9 members who are the companies on the right-hand side of that graph. They are 9 out of the top 10 UK port operators in revenue terms. They operate about 40 ports around the UK, handling about 75% of the UK's port volume, and that's everything from very short sea agricultural products all the way through up to very large bulkers and enormous container vessels doing the Asian to Europe rotations. So that's who we are and who we represent, and there's a certain crossover on this map with the map that Peter showed about locations of free ports, but I will come back to that. What I'm going to try and do is put Brexit in a slightly broader context, because you've heard of lots of great specific detail so far, so I don't intend to go over that too much. So where are we on Brexit right now, and is it possible to start making any kind of structural judgment about where we are? So the last actual trade data that we could find was some stuff that came out, was reported by Bloomberg on Friday, and that's the sort of complicated graphs that you're looking at on the left-hand side of this slide. The remarkable thing that came out to me from looking at this data is quite how well some of the UK's trade flows have gone. The exports to the EU from the UK remarkably robust, bounced back from January to a level in April that was round about where we were in terms of pre-withdrawal at times. Imports from the EU struggling, it must be said, at a lower level, and perhaps some of the features that Peter and Salian highlighted about the difficulties of importing into the UK, maybe a factor there. But those effects as well, you could see offset or in contrast to what we saw about this time last year with those big falls, the black line linked to COVID. And in many ways, from a port's perspective, it's very much a sort of joint perspective. The same is true, by the way, from exports around the world. You see that the big drop off in the black line, and not just a sort of resilient red line for 2021, but a very, very strong performance in terms of imports from the rest of the world into the UK. Unsurprisingly, given that, and the more up-to-date data we have is for UK MPG members, just in terms of shipping movements, you can see that the blue line, which is 2021, has seen a recovery from the immediate post-Brexit period, and is now tracking much more along sort of pre-COVID levels, 2019 levels, rather than the steep drop-off we saw in 2020. So that's kind of what the data tells us, but the data actually hides a lot of important detail. And I would say that the resilience of some of those lines is actually testament to a lot of the hard work that people have been doing behind the scenes, ports, logistics companies, lawyers, etc., working their way through a lot of detail, making compromises, making judgments calls in order to keep trade flowing. So, the resilience of the trade flows, my hypothesis would be, is almost despite the changes that we've seen rather than because of them. And as Richard, Salian, Peter have said, we are not done with Brexit yet. We are not done with Brexit, border arrangements. And I think it's probably far too early to be starting to make structural judgments about what the impact of Brexit in particular would be. As we've said, there are some real challenges. There are new rules coming. There are new frictions and impediments coming as well. But so far, a pretty heroic job by people involved in the business of keeping trade moving. From a sort of broader ports perspective, I just want to sort of step back a little bit and say it has been a very busy time for ports, and I would suggest maritime trade in and out of the UK, but also more generally. So from a big port perspective in the UK, Brexit is one of the things that they've seen that's made this a very turbulent time. There's clearly been the impact of COVID, both on the economy as well, but also in the way we all work. But also more recently, the Evergreen Suez related supply chain disruptions. And our experience at the moment is that the combination of these factors is almost reinforcing each other, so that cargo owners, supply chain professionals, etc., really sitting back now and thinking, have we got the right balance between just in time, between more resilient or latent supply chains, etc. And they are being asked questions by their board about how do we remain resilient in terms of supply chains going forward, our supply chains, the ones that we service ourselves. And people thinking doing some really important, potentially strategically quite different thinking about how they operate their supply chains. Now, there is, if anybody reads The Economist, you'll have seen there's an article in the most recent one that talks about, is this the end of global supply chains? And the answer is probably not. There are some very good economic reasons why global and specialization of skills and resource, why global supply chains exist. But what we're probably thinking about is different ways of operating some of those global supply chains. So potentially some reshoring or nearshoring of either parts of the supply chain themselves or some of the logistics activity attached to them, and really crucially the role of data and information and decision making and transparency in how people operate their supply chains. But at the bottom of this, everybody on this call knows that absolutely the cost effectiveness of those solutions still remains absolutely key. Also, what we're dealing with is a reinvention in business models, particularly for some of our end use sectors, and retail is a particularly good example of that, which is people have commented, retailers themselves have commented that they've seen a degree of, for example, e-commerce change that they expected over perhaps 20-25 years happen in about 9 months, right? So once again, that has some pretty profound implications on not just the ports but the supply chains as a whole. You'll see the graph on the top right hand side of this chart shows the record levels of warehousing demand that were occurring last year, so a trend that we see continuing. But also again, data and digital, and how do we not just present to the customer, but also how do we operate our supply chain? And as I said, Brexit, I think it's just remarkable what a good job has been done by the industry so far. But as Peter pointed out with his graph, we have more changes coming down the line, more frictions coming down the line. Some of the things that we've seen is that it's a very competitive, very cost-sensitive market, moving goods to and from the EU by sea. We've seen new facilities, new sailings, new services come on board across all the different types of freight modes, so accompanied ro-ro, trailers, low containers, as well as people try to look for different ways, provide different solutions for their customers. And as Richard has said, it's not just the direct impacts on the trade. HGV driver shortages, an indirect impact of Brexit, but one that impacts ports, and not just ports engaged in EU trade as well. HGV driver shortages, driving implications for port connectivity in a much broader sense, and indeed, the connectivity of freight through the UK. And then finally, I was just going to say, so where does Brexit sit within the sort of investment agenda of a port, or its resource allocation? And it sits as part of a number of different priorities. So yes, it is a very important thing, but it sits within some broader themes as well. I'll just highlight a couple of those here. The first part is, absolutely. Brexit continues to be a very significant cause or driver of resource capacity, investment capacity for ports in the UK. As Peter said, we are building border control posts on ports throughout the UK. The picture on the top left-hand side here is inside the one at Bristol Port 2 weeks ago, as I was looking around it, and it is in what's relatively advanced fit out. And they promised me it will be ready by the original date of the 1st of July. But as well as the physical infrastructure, there continues to be significant work that needs to get put into some of the processes and IT systems that sit behind it as well. Going to the top right, Peter's also mentioned Freeports. A number of our members are involved in Freeport propositions. There's a groovy graphic here for the Thames Freeport, but others are available. And they do, and this is a big focus of effort for those who are involved in it. We run a Freeport operators contact group, and I can tell you there is a large amount of work right now going into taking paper concepts and turning them into a sort of physical, almost a physical reality, ready to go by Q4 for this year, and there is a significant amount of work that continues to be done, both by the port operators and their partners in the consortium as well, to develop the outline and full business cases, but also from the government as well. There are some parts of the government proposition that are at best still opaque, and we need to clarify those pretty quickly. Bottom left-hand side, net zero transition, a huge driver of interest and development for ports as we do our bit for the net zero transition. The picture there is a computer CGI impression of what the new GE wind turbine facility on Teesside. Just one example of the very serious investment the ports and their partners are putting into developing the capability that we need to drive the really ambitious and welcome targets that the UK has about getting to net zero. And then finally, bottom right, it's not just about physical development, right? There are some very significant needs about resourcing the port of the future. There are some important gaps in key functional areas that we have now. We have a strong sense that we need to, we have future skill needs gaps, and we know that we have further to work on our sort of, diversity levels within the sector in order to make sure that we're accessing the broadest, pool of talent possible in order to meet both of those requirements. And with that, Sue, I will shut up and let us get back to questions.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Tim. And thank you to all our speakers. We have one question in, but if you want to put some others into the chat, we will get to them in a second. So I think we've touched on some really important issues there. Particularly some of the things that I wanted to highlight was the significance of just in time as we get to Q4. As we start to come out of COVID, as we know, lots of high beverage areas around Q4 with Christmas, New Year's Eve and various other sort of things and events. And I know from talking to people in the trade, I mean, just getting wine from Italy to the UK now, there's an extra 2 weeks in the distribution train just to get the goods into the UK. So people do need to really think about how and what they're going to do with the supply chains, as Tim highlighted there. And I think we're going to get a new invention of just in time, which has got a legacy buffer put in it. Because without that, we haven't got the warehouse capacity here in the UK to hold all the stock. So I think going forward, we're going to reinvent supply chains, but I don't think everything is going to be reshored, as Tim said. And I think it's going to be time that we're going to readjust and reinvent ourselves going forward. And that leads on to the question that we've got in the chat. What would be the reason for large increased volumes into the UK, but actually smaller increased volumes from the UK into the EU, i.e. exports? Has anybody got any thoughts about why we're exporting less but importing more from the panel?
Maybe I can come in on that one, unless Richard, it pops up on my screen. Do you have something? Otherwise, I'll just say I think it goes back to the point I made about at the beginning. There used to be stuff. UK used to be a reasonable hub for importing things into the EU from. So stuff would come into the UK and go onwards to the EU. That traffic has, to a certain extent, dried up. So I think you're going to see much less of that in the future as people will reconfigure their supply chains to send stuff straight to Europe or mainland the EU rather than through the UK. So I think that's probably from my perspective where I see that. Don't know if other people have got an additional point to that.
I think I'd just say, yeah, Peter, I think I would say yes, that's one of the things. It's all of the above, as Tim said. That Brexit is one of many things going on at the moment in the ports and logistics sector. We're recovering through the pandemic and various lockdowns, and there has been a bit of a reset. Perhaps wouldn't explain this so much, but there has been an interesting dynamic in that there's definitely been a shift from driver accompanied to unaccompanied, and even a little bit to low as well from Europe. Also, we've seen a big shift in terms of the land bridge traffic that uses Great Britain to cross between the Republic of Ireland or the island of Ireland and the continent of Europe, and we've seen a lot more direct services now sailing from places like Antwerp and Zeebrugge and Rotterdam and France direct through to the Republic of Ireland, particularly, which bypasses the land bridge, which obviously has an impact on UK freight, and particularly driver accompanied, because unaccompanied, yes, there is unaccompanied using the land bridge, but you know, that just in time element, it's much quicker to just drive it straight through. And how long those I mean, some of the shipping services are resetting, but you know, a lot of them are there for the time being. So how long that lasts, I don't know. And it only adds a few extra hours. And if there's less paperwork and less cost, that is quite an interesting one to watch, and has real implications for not only the southeast ports in England, like the sort of Eurotunnels, Dovers and Portsmouths, etc. But it also has an implication for Welsh ports, who have seen a massive decline in activity. The Ro-Ro ports, Fishguard, Pembroke and Holyhead, have seen a real decline as those new controls have come in, and some traders are using the northern routes from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, because although there are controls, it's perceived to be slightly easier. So yeah, there's a lot to factor in, a lot to consider, and as Tim said, it's only just beginning really. We wait and see what happens in January, and there could be more impacts.
Brilliant. I'm going to move us on now to the next question that's come in on Freeports, and obviously in Peter's slide he said that we're hoping they'll be in by the end of this year, but the question is, if there's a delay in Freeports and with their development process, what alternative short-term measures are in place, if any, that the panel know of? Richard, Tim?
Tim, you want to go?
Yeah, so I think, so it's all the mood music and all the messaging from the government is still, it's Q4, right? So, you know, government departments have been told that they need to be ready with their elements of the, you know, the detail of their proposition by end of October. So you know, I think that they're still pushing for that. I think what is more likely to happen is that what you might have is a staged introduction of some of these things as some of the elements become clearer or less clear. For many of the ports, actually, they want to go as soon as possible, because they saw quite a bump in terms of interest from potential investors quite soon after the declaration or the award of the sites. So there's quite a push to try and capture some of that emerging interest, you know, as quickly as possible. So, you know, I think what we'll get is more of a sort of staged introduction. In the short term, some of the elements that were in the package, such as a expansion of the scope of permitted development rights for ports, have already started, are already in effect, and indeed not just for Freeports. All right, so there's some element of it that's happening already, but I anticipate that, you know, some degree of victory will be declared by Q4, whatever stage we're at. But the reality of it might be a little bit more staged after that. And so it might be second guessing the question slightly, but I think it's probably worth disentangling, if you can, Freeports and Brexit somewhat, as Peter mentioned in his presentation, because in terms of Freeports being a solution to some of the Brexit issues with new border controls and customs, yes, it could be useful in terms of certain types of operation, but it's not really going to help a lot of our, what I describe as gateway traffic, so goods that's just coming through across the quay and out the port gate without sitting around. Yes, the Freeports, given their wide scope, not just covering customs, but also planning, as Tim mentioned, and other things, could help build better facilities, but that's probably not going to happen in the short term, or certainly not by the autumn. So I think it's worth just seeing that Freeports is an economic development tool, not a Brexit preparedness tool. You know, where you're fixing issues because you have new customs controls, etc. So yes, if you're manufacturing on site, could be handy, especially now that we've left the single market and customs union. But in terms of getting ready for next year, I would say, and the next phase of the Brexit transition, I don't think it's worth mixing the two up.
Brilliant. And our next question is, do you think the fact that the UK, all our ports, what inverted commas are privatised, I know we've got some trust ports, but basically they operate on a private model, will actually help the UK in exporting and be a benefit to them?
I don't know. I can go on that one. I don't think ownership does have a factor in obviously the commercial and forward-looking strategies of the port operators, but in this sort of post or moving towards a post-pandemic era, those commercial beasts that are ports are going to be competing irrespective of their ownership model. And I would say ownership is, I think a lot can be made of it, but actually we're all on a broadly speaking level playing field, notwithstanding one or two bits of money or government policies in respect of Brexit, which sort of vary the level playing field somewhat. But we're all on a kind of even keel, so to speak. Yeah, one of the things that the EU does do that we don't concede is it does provide a loose level playing field for European ports, which the UK competed or competes with, etc. So I don't think it's, personally, others may disagree, I don't think ownership is a big challenge, and it might make ports a bit more agile and able in the UK and able to respond to commercial opportunities, etc., without going through sort of political channels. I don't know. I mean, quite often certainly some of the big public loan ports in Europe are pretty agile at responding to commercial opportunities. Might be better for finance if the public sector in Europe is tight for money, and if ports in the UK want to borrow to finance new infrastructure developments. I think there's kind of something to consider moving forward. But broadly speaking, I think the ports are in quite good shape in the UK, notwithstanding pandemic impacts and impacts on things like passenger activities. But I think we're broadly okay at the moment. We're certainly better than the aviation sector that's fared very badly in the last few months.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think when these things get discussed at the I don't notice a huge difference around tables where it's a privately owned port or a very large trust port about how they operate, their orientation, etc. So I think within the UK, it's probably not too much of a difference. Like Richard said, Rotterdam, Hamburg, Antwerp, they seem to do a pretty good job of being global import and export hubs as well. I'm not sure whether there's something around the sort of landside development that might be slightly different for the UK than Europe because of the nature of how they're owned and run, but that might be pretty marginal. So I think well-run ports, whatever their ownership model, are predisposed to be excellent long-term sustainable import and export hubs, as well as economic engines in their own right.
Brilliant. And our next question is based around systems. And as obviously the UK are outside of the EU, do you see in the future a problem with different systems in Europe to the UK and the ports talking to each other? But from my experience talking to the port of Antwerp is they have problems talking to the ports in France because there isn't a unified system, as I understand it, across Europe either. But it'll be interesting. Do you know of any sort of, in that lovely chart that Peter showed at the end there, about this harmonisation of systems to make sure we do actually keep all the systems as they get invented going forward, that they all talk to each other?
Is that one for Tim?
Maybe Tim or maybe Peter. I don't know if you know.
Who had the fluffy chart? Sorry, that was the
Peter.
Peter.
Ah, sorry.
Yeah, it's a little bit outside my area of expertise, but I think if you say it's we've gone to I think the UK resurrected chief that was used to bring things into the UK is being used for the purpose it wasn't designed for, and certainly it's having to handle a much larger volume of transactions. I think there will inevitably have to be an investment on all sides in improving the systems and the way they talk to each other. But I think that's pretty universal to everywhere. And of course, government IT projects have a long history of coming in on time and on budget, of course. So that's going to be a relief. We'll see. But it's Yeah, I don't think I've got anything to add. I mean, whether the others have seen more detail.
No, I know it's something that's been talked about, as I say, because I was on a call with Antwerp and a number of other European ports and the UK ports, and they are trying to, amongst themselves, look to see if there's some form of overarching system that will take data from one to the other. I always remember DFDS said that every time they enter a port community system, they have to re-input all the data. It's impossible for them as a shipping line at the moment to be able to just hit a button and the data goes to all the different port community systems there are right across Europe. So I think it's something, as we get into our new sort of super web, whatever it's going to be, of the IoT of things, that will come about. And I think there's got to be a data interface and exchange, but it's certainly not there at the moment. That's the end of our questions, and I'm just mindful that we are a little bit over time. So I think hopefully you'd all like to join me in thanking our panelists for a fantastic session. Thank you very much. I hope you've all learned something and found it interesting. We've got a couple of claps coming through, so thank you. As I said, we will be running another one of these on Freeports, and I do hope an invitation to all our guest speakers, if they want to come back and talk on that, we'd really love to have you back at Worcester. There will be, in sort of about 2 days' time, a video of this on the website of the Worcester-UK.net website. So if any colleagues or you want to listen to it again, you can feel free to listen to it at your leisure whenever you like. And also most of our online Zoom events that we've been running over the last 14 months are all online as well. So you can go back and have a look at some of our wellness ones as well, particularly some of those about stress relief, which we all need now and then. Worcester has a very full programme, so go and have a look at all our events. All our events are open events as we're running them online. And we look forward to seeing you on another event, and enjoy your sunny afternoon, everybody. Thank you all very much for being with us.
Thanks, Sue.
Thanks, everyone.